Let's now look at the while loop. We have previously looked at the for loop, and now let's go into the while loop. If you remember, your for loop had the following syntax. So the keyword for, then you had initialize loop counter, semicolon, test the loop counter, and then you had modify loop counter. And this was the for block, and this is the closing for the for loop. Now the way the loop is executed is as follows. Once you hit the keyword for, you first do the initialization statement or the initialize loop counter. Then you test the loop counter. And then you execute these statements here. And then you modify the loop counter. So you have initialize, test, and modify all in the same line. The while loop is very much similar to the for loop. It's going to just differ in the places where the initialize loop counter, test loop counter, and modify loop counter are placed in the code. So in your while loop, you first have the initialize loop counter. And then the keyword while, followed by the test loop counter. Under the while block, you're going to have, let's say, the three statements, ix, iy, and iz. Now you do not end the while block. Instead, this is where you have the modify loop counter. And then you can close the block. So your initialize loop counter in the for loop was here. In the while loop, it's going to be here. Your test loop counter was here. In your while loop, it's going to be here. The modify loop counter was here in the for loop, but in the while loop, you have it here. So it's just the places where 1, 2, 3 are. That's the only difference between the for loop and the while loop. Now the question comes is, which loop do you want to use? Do you want to use a for loop or do you want to use a while loop? The main thing that you should understand is that any program that is written in a for loop can also be written with a while loop. So it doesn't really matter. Some programmers prefer to use a for loop. Some programmers prefer to use a while loop. I personally, it depends upon how my code is structured, but most of the times I go for a for loop. And when you're given a while loop, you should be able to convert it into a for loop. And when you're given a for loop, you should be able to convert it into a while loop. One more reason why I prefer the for loop is because I can see how many times my loop runs just by looking at one line of code. But if you look at the while loop, you have to go through various lines in the code. So for the first time, you have to see where is the initialize loop counter statement and where is my modify loop counter and what's my loop counter condition testing. So these three can be located at different places in the code. And just imagine like if there are like 1,000 statements here, you have to scroll through 1,000 lines just to see how the loop counter is being modified. So in that case, I would prefer to use a for loop.